Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and I've been a big fan of these 8bitdo replica controllers. They've been making these for a couple of years now. They look and feel a lot like the originals, and in this case they added some analog sticks to the very familiar SNES controller. But maybe you want to use your original NES or SNES controllers with your new devices, and now there's a way to do that. So what I've got here is the original NES controller that came on my NES from 30-something years ago, but I've modded it with one of 8bitdo's new mod kits that sell for 20 bucks, and you can pop in this circuit board inside of the controller, take out its old guts, screw it back together, and you now have a controller that works with the Switch, PC, Android, the Mac, along with the retro receiver modules that will work with new things like the analog NT Mini here or your original NES. They've got versions for the NES controller, the Super Nintendo controller. They also support the Classic Edition controllers from those new mini consoles from Nintendo. And you can also mod your 6-button Genesis or Mega Drive controller too. So lots of ways to get those old controllers working again. And we're going to do a review of this kit here in just a second. But I do want to let you know, in the interest of full disclosure, that 8bitdo sent me these kits free of charge. However, nobody is paying for this review. All the opinions you're about to hear are my own, and they are not reviewing or approving this video before it was uploaded. So let's get into it now and see what these mod kits are all about. So let's take a closer look now at the hardware. This is the circuit board that comes in the box. This particular version works with the NES Classic controller. You're going to see a battery on them also so that they can operate wirelessly. These will not work wired, so the only way you can use these things is through a wireless connection. There is a USB port here at the top. It will be covered up by the case of the controller, but I assume at some point, if they ever have a firmware update, that's how you would implement the update. However, you'll have to take your controller apart to get there, but in my testing it seems to be working pretty well right out of the box, and there were no firmware updates needed when I got it. This little thing here replaces the cable that used to be going out of the controller, and you also plug in your power supply into this to charge it. So what they do is they give you this little cable here in the box. I wish it was a little bit longer, and all you have to do is plug it into a USB power source, and what you do, there's that plastic nub here on this SNES controller, and we just have to plug it in like so and then attach it to power. It will light up and let you know that it is charging. They say you get about 7 hours of gameplay on these before they need to be charged again, so they're not going to have the battery life that some more premium controllers have, but it's still, again, pretty cool to use your original equipment with it there. They also give you a screwdriver in the box, but I found the included screwdrivers to not work all that well, especially for my old NES controllers. I've got one here that we started working on, and I was worried the screws were going to get stripped because they're stuck in there from 30 years of abuse, and it was really hard to get this particular controller taken apart with the included screwdriver. So if you have higher quality screwdrivers, I would maybe use those. Another consideration would be to maybe look at getting new screws to replace the old ones with when you put it back together. Because I did find that you really want to get this thing very tightly reassembled so it really feels exactly the same it did before you took it apart, and new screws might be a little bit easier to work with on the retightening than the old ones might be. Now, the modification process itself is quite easy. You just have to unscrew the screws on the back of the controller. That will free up the circuit board. As long as you keep all the little button pads in place, all you have to do is just swap in that new circuit board and close it up. The ribbon cable on the charging connector for the NES controller was a little difficult to work with, but beyond that, it was a very simple swap out. But again, getting this thing tight is the real challenge, especially the older controllers. So this one feels a little looser than it did before I started, and I think it's due to the fact that I just could not get these screws tightened up as tight as they were originally 30 years ago. So that might be something you encounter on your controllers. I did try the NES Classic Edition here, and this one feels very, very close to how it felt before I started. So I think the fact that this controller is newer made it a better target for that. And it was a little bit longer of a process on the SNES Classic controller just because you have to get the shoulder buttons mounted in, but not all that much longer. A pretty simple process overall. Now, I found compatibility to be on par with other 8bitdo controllers, which is very good. So they worked okay with my Android TV devices, my NVIDIA Shields. I was able to sit across the room from them and play a few retro games on those, no problems there. I didn't have any issues with my PC either. It connected up via Bluetooth and supports X input, so you can play compatible games with that. I think the Super Nintendo controller is probably the more practical one, just given that the layout here largely mirrors the layout that we're using today for many modern games. And that was where we ran into some trouble here on the Switch. So right now I'm trying to get the Sonic game loaded up here. This is Sonic Mania. It just doesn't register any button pushes. This is the primary controller right now. It's showing up as a Nintendo Pro controller if we go down to our controller menu here. But for whatever reason, it's working fine in menus, but just not in the Sonic Mania game. We can't get the game to start. But other games did work okay. So if I go over to Dragon's Trap here, the new Wonder Boy remake, this one is controllable, but I do recommend using the SNES versus the NES because you don't have enough buttons on here to make use of most of the games that you'll play on the Switch, including some of the retro-inspired titles. And the reason is on the NES controller here is that B and A are mapped to B and A on your Switch controller. So if you have a game that needs Y or X, or of course the shoulder buttons here, you're out of luck. So I think the SNES is probably the better choice here for these kinds of games. In this game, Y is the fireball, which is an important part of the game, and you can't shoot a fireball using the NES controller, so just bear all that in mind there. But these things really shine when you're using them with a retro console like a real SNES or NES or the analog NT Mini here. Basically, these little receiver adapters, which cost about $20 to $25, will work with anything that accepts that plug there. They're actually powered by the connector. Even on the original NES, they work the same way. And I found the experience to be pretty much identical to what I was playing with on the wired controller. Up until today, this controller was the one I was using wired, and it seems to be really feeling about the same. I'm not really feeling any weirdness here. It does seem to come together quite well. I'm going to show you two things now. We're going to look first at a little game controller tester so you can see how all the diagonals work on the controller. And we're also going to look at latency and lag that these wireless devices introduce. Now, I found a really helpful ROM file for the original NES to do some diagonal testing here on the controller. And I demodded this controller, put the old circuit board back in, and ran a comparison that you can see here. And it seems to be performing about the same, but I found that really it's a matter of getting these screws tightened up so that things don't move around all that much, and that seemed to make the difference. I also ran some latency testing to see how much lag is introduced into the mix here. To do that, we record the screen at 240 frames per second with my iPhone and see how long it takes for a button push to register on screen. And it looks like it adds, at least on the original NES connection here, about 12 milliseconds or so. So when we had the NT Mini using a wired controller on this display here, we had about a 40 millisecond lag between the time a button was pushed and the time that something registers on screen. With the wireless modification, we were looking at about 52 milliseconds. So not all that much lag introduced, probably about 10 to 12 milliseconds. And really it's a matter of what your display introduces into the mix that will make the biggest difference. But by and large, not a lot of noticeable lag here. Again, about 10 or 12 milliseconds. We also tested the Switch to see if the lag was any different than maybe a Joy-Con attached, for example. And there on the Switch, we saw that we had the Joy-Con performing at about 68 milliseconds and the modification on the controller performing around 76 milliseconds. So not all that much lag introduced here, still very playable. So as modifications go, this is a pretty easy process. You just take out the old board, swap in one of these new ones, and your old NES controller becomes something new and more compatible. But again, my biggest issue has been just getting these screws tightened up so that it feels about the same it did before I started the process. But if you are able to get that tightness there, it's going to be a very similar experience, and now your controller is much more usable with very minimal input lag introduced into the process there. So for 20 bucks, a pretty good deal and very, very easy to do. So don't let the circuit boards here intimidate you. A very simple swap, no soldering required, and is something I can recommend if you really want that old school feel on your new games. Until next time, this is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Chris Allegretta, Tom Albrecht, Bill Reiner, and Kalyan Kumar. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to Lon.TV/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit Lon.TV/s.